What if I told you that underneath the entire English language is a relatively logical and easy to understand system that will tell you how and when to use the right intonation? In fact, it's as simple as this. Believe it or not, there's actually a reason why we rise in some places and fall in other places. So then, what is this hidden subconscious intonation system, and how can you use it to hack into the personality of the English language and use intonation naturally and effortlessly like a native speaker? Perhaps the biggest reason why English intonation is so difficult to learn and to teach is because it's actually not just one thing. There are actually 3 different types of intonation that we can identify, but they all use the same underlying engine or system, but in different ways. So what we're going to do first, I'm going to give you a very basic introduction to each of the 3 types of intonation, as well as the core of that system and how it works in all 3. Then, as we go further through the lesson, we're going to look more specifically at each type and look at different details and examples of how you can manipulate that basic system to create different effects. Now, the core of the system is very simple. Gravity. Now, that might seem too simple, but stay with me here. First, let's talk about structural intonation. Now, it's called structural intonation because it's very closely tied to the grammar or the structure of what you're saying. For example, a basic statement versus a yes or no question. We fall at the end of statements, positive or negative, and we rise at the end of yes or no questions. Now, there's a reason for this. The reason that most teachers will tell you is because when we fall, it sounds finished. It tells the listener that you're done with your statement. And if we rise, then it tells the listener that we want a response. Now, that's true, but that's still above the surface. That doesn't explain the underlying system of why falling and rising creates that effect. So the first thing is that there's silence, right? Before you say anything, there's silence. This you can think of as gravity. It's a 0 point, okay? It's the ground. So we're on the ground, we're flat. All right. Now, anything that you say will immediately come up out of that silence, against that silence. And in an abstract way, you can think of it sort of like you have a surface and something is standing up on that surface, right? And then we go through the sentence, we walk through the sentence. Okay. So we go from silence, we start talking, blah, 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 blah. We fall at the end. Why? Because we're returning to that silence. It makes your statement feel complete, okay? Gravity pulls it down. It's like you're sitting, you get up, you walk, 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 and you sit back down. You get pulled back down by the gravity, and your walk is done. Put another way, let's say you have a ball, or in my case, a Pikachu, because I'm just a poor English teacher and I can't afford a ball. So what happens if I take this Pikachu, I throw him up, he falls down, right? He returns to that basic state of gravity, that 0 point, because what goes up must come down. Now, what happens in a yes or no question? Well, if I rise at the end, the reason why it signals to you, the listener, that I'm expecting a response, that it feels incomplete. Why does it feel incomplete? Because it's still up in the air. It hasn't come back down to Earth, with that gravity. So this is like I take my ball, my Pikachu ball, and I'm talking, and then I toss it up to you. So it's up in the air. I say, hey, do you like Pikachu? And then what happens? Well, I toss it to you, you catch it. All right, gotta catch them all. Ha! Anyway, You catch it and you're bringing it back down with a response. You're completing the question. Do you like Pikachu? Yes, I like Pikachu. Fall. So that creates that feeling of completion. Now, if you're familiar at all with music theory and the idea of calls and responses between musical phrases, this is basically the same thing that's happening. If you don't know anything about that, that's fine. You don't have to care. Now, there are other things like exclamations, lists, other things that you can do with your rise and your fall. And we're going to talk about all that later, but that's the basic concept of how the engine works in structural intonation, okay? We're either going to fall at the end and it feels complete because we're back on solid ground, we've landed, or we're going to rise, it will feel incomplete so that it can land back on solid ground and be finished. It's like the answer cancels out the question and resolves it. And don't worry, we're going to talk about WH questions and stuff too. That's not an exception. You'll see all that later. Now, the second type of intonation is attentional intonation. And I call it attentional because it's about attention, focus, okay? You might be familiar with the concept of the focus word. Let's just take a basic statement. I want to go to the beach. Okay. We start in silence. We start at ground zero. We're firmly on the floor. Okay. Now, in terms of how the system works for attentional intonation, we have to talk about stress before we get to the intonation because it's actually all tied together in English. We know that English is a stress-timed language, so the unstressed syllables are going to be shorter, quieter, often lower in pitch, and the stressed syllables are going to be longer, louder, often higher in pitch compared to those unstressed syllables. Let's say I say I want to go to the beach. I is not stressed. So we start in silence. I is weak. It's unstressed, so it's weak. Okay? So it only has a little bit of strength to stand up against the force of gravity. Okay, it's being pulled down because we always want to try to reach completion or conclusion, right? Which is at the end of the statement. So I stands up, but it's very weak because it's not stressed. So it only goes up a little bit. It's very short, it's very quiet, it's being compacted by gravity. Okay, I. Then we say want. A want is stressed. So it gets a little more force, it's stronger, right? So it can stand up against gravity more and it stands out. Notice the language here. This is all relevant and connected in the subconscious. It stands up more against the gravity and makes it more noticeable, so it stands out, which means it's easier to notice because it's stronger. Okay? So I want. We fall into to, or if we say wanna, okay? Want to, wanna, whatever. Either way, it's not stressed, so we're getting pulled back down. To does not have a lot of strength, so it's closer to the ground. Go, stress again, it's stronger. It can stand up against that gravity. To, the, okay, these are weaker. They can't stand up as much. They don't stand out as much. Beach, stressed again. Okay, and then we fall at the very end. Now, in addition to that, notice reductions. So just because something is unstressed doesn't mean it reduces, but in the case of I, to, and the, we can reduce all of those. And you can think of that as a further collapse into that force of gravity. So when we say to, that doesn't mean it's stressed, it's just fully enunciated. To, I want to. Now if I reduce it to ta, that oo is sort of collapsing under the weight of the gravity and changing into Okay, so it's even shorter, it's even quieter. Now that's fine for the basic stress, right? That should make sense. Then what happens on the focus word? Okay, so the basics of attentional intonation. The focus word is going to be the last content word by default. With no special context, it's the last content word in the sentence by default. So in this case, it would be beach. So what that means, if we're giving it attention, we want somebody to pay a little extra attention to the focus word. Attention, focus, it all makes sense, right? So want is stressed, stronger, stands up against gravity, we hear it. I want. Go is stressed, same thing. Beach is stressed, same thing, but in order to make the focus word stand out, you have to add some pitch to it, a little extra pitch, okay, so that it sounds a little bit higher than the other stressed words. We might also add a little bit extra length, a little bit extra loudness. So if I say, want go beach, want go beach, it kind of needs to push up and be even more stronger, like, oh, look at me, I'm the focus, I'm the strongest, okay? Now with attentional intonation, you can shift the focus word for different reasons based on the context and the purpose of what you're saying. So let's say you think Tom wants to go to the beach, but I say, no, I want to go to the beach. So now beach doesn't get that focus. It's still going to fall at the end because it's a regular statement. But now I'm bringing all this attention. I'm making I really strong so it stands out. I. Okay, notice we don't really reduce anymore because it's I. I'm making it nice and full and strong. It's full sound, full word. I want to go to the beach. Now there's different ways that you can affect the exact tone there. We don't care about that right now. The main idea is we're making it stronger so it stands out and it gets that focus. You can see so far that we have two different types of intonation. There's the intonation for structure, which the basics are fall or rise at the end. There's more than that we'll talk about. But in addition to that, working at the same time is the attentional intonation, which takes a particular word and gives it a little more focus, a little more pitch, a little more strength, so that it stands out even more for whatever reason we need it to do that. Now there's a third type of intonation, and this is emotional intonation. Now how emotional intonation works is a little bit different, but it still uses the same basic mechanics and the same idea of gravity. The biggest difference with emotional intonation is that instead of it being based on the structure, and instead of being related to a particular focus, it's the overall feeling of the sentence or maybe the thought group, the phrase. You're giving color or a certain feeling to your overall sentence, okay? That's the big difference. Now, there's a few ways to do this. The two basic ways is up and down. And you'll see that this matches the gravity idea perfectly. Because what happens if I want to sound positive, if I want to sound friendly, if I want to sound upbeat? It's a very important term here connected in the subconscious, upbeat, which might be happy, excited, right? All these sort of positive emotions. I'm going to use a lighter, higher sort of pitch or tone throughout what I'm saying. So if I feel very happy and I say, hey, you know, I just love Pikachu. This is just the best Pokemon ever, like really. Okay. Notice how it sounds overall. It's very light. It's up. It's kind of punchy. There's lots of variation. And the reason why, either A, it's going to stay pretty high, or B, it's going to kind of keep getting pulled down by gravity, but keep going back up, right? Not necessarily like, I really love Pikachu. That's a little too much, but there's more variation in the tone, right? And that's because the reason why it feels lighter or positive is because it's able to stand higher. It's able to sort of resist the gravity more, right? So it feels lighter. It feels more effortless. And that creates a positive tone, positive effect in general, okay? Now, what happens if we go the other way? What happens if I say, you know, I don't understand why people like Pikachu. It's so depressing because there's so many other great Pokemon. I'm just so sad. Okay. Now you'll notice, yeah, there's a rise and fall. We still have the attentional intonation at work. We still have the structural intonation at work. But I'm keeping an overall lower tone. I'm keeping a lower pitch. I'm closer to the ground. I'm closer to the gravity. The gravity is making it heavy. Okay. If you're sounding sad or angry, we tend to stay lower. We have a a heavier sound. Or you can also use that type of tone to sound very serious, right? Playful, light, carefree, right? La 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 la. Serious tone. You have to do that. It's very important. It's heavy. It's being pulled down to gravity, okay? Because we're trying to settle it. We're trying to conclude it. And so that's how the system works through emotional intonation. You can either keep it lighter and airier and sort of flying above. It's not as pulled down by the gravity. It sounds more positive overall. Or you can keep it lower and heavier and darker, and that's going to make it sound more serious or more negative. So in all three cases, which these all work at the same time, that's why it's complicated. That's why it's difficult to teach and difficult to learn. But we're going to go and break everything down to make it all make perfect sense and how you can manipulate and change things. But that basic concept should make sense, how this idea of the gravity that wants to pull down to completion can affect things structurally, can affect things attentionally by making a particular word stronger, able to resist that gravity more, or emotionally by keeping an overall lighter tone or an overall heavier tone. That is the secret to American English intonation. Parts of this I don't think are specific to American English. Other languages probably use some or all of these same mechanics, maybe in different ways. Maybe other languages use pitch in ways that we don't use in American English, and that's all fine. But in terms of American English itself, this really seems to be how everything is working under the surface and how it translates to different effects above the surface with what you're saying. And that brings us to our second big point, is that everything that you say is rooted in a particular context and has a particular purpose. This is the other part of the engine or the system that drives intonation. This is clearest and easiest to see with attentional intonation because we're literally moving that focus word around for emphasis, for clarification, or contrast, whatever the reason is. But if my purpose is to get a response from you for something that I don't know if it's true or not, yes or no, it's a yes or no question. I want to leave it up in the air so that you can then take that and resolve it, bring it back down. So rising does give that feeling of incompletion, but there's also a purpose. I want to know true or false, yes or no, exist or doesn't exist. That's the purpose of a yes or no question. That's the nature of a yes or no question. So if that's the type of information I'm after, I want to leave it hanging. So you can see that it's not just this engine of gravity, but there's actually a purpose to why I would rise. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to dive deeper into different details, different combinations of rise and fall, and different effects of tone of voice that you can then use and start to feel using this core system.